On December 29, 2003, around 7 p.m., Mr. Choi, 34, who lived in Gyeongdong, Songpagu, Seoul, Korea, came home from work as usual. He rang the doorbell and knocked on the door, but there was no response from inside the house. So, without a key, he called his wife's best friend, Ms. Lee, and asked if she was with his wife. But Ms. Lee said that his wife, Mrs. Park, did not go to her place. Because Ms. Lee lived near their house and usually went to their house 3 to 4 times a week, she was very familiar with Mrs. Park and was as close as a family. So when she heard the news, she was also very worried and anxious. She immediately rushed over and also tried to ring the doorbell and knocked on the door, but still did not get any response. So, they decided to try to look inside the house through the window of the small room in the corridor. But because the window was equipped with iron bars that could not be entered, they could only look in through the gap in the window. They found that Mrs. Park was not in the small room, but her bag was there. According to Ms. Lee, Mr. Choi's wife usually keeps the key in her bag, so they managed to get the window open and got Mrs. Park's bag, and really found the key in the bag. They immediately opened the door, but just at the moment they went in, an extremely horrible scene appeared in front of them. Mrs. Park, 31, lay on the floor with her face covered by her long skirt, and her neck strangled by a noose tied to a clothesline, and was found dead. Next to Mrs. Park, her 10-month-old daughter, who had also had a tied plastic bag placed over her head, was also found not breathing. And in the room, her 2-year-old son, who had a piece of cloth wrapped around his neck, was also dead. All 3 members of Mrs. Park's family were killed. Mr. Choi immediately blackened both eyes and collapsed. He immediately called the police. When the police arrived on the scene, they found that the apartment had only one iron door, and the windows of the hallway corridor had security bars installed, and the bars had not been damaged. The family lives on the 7th floor, and it was almost impossible to break in from the balcony. In addition, Mrs. Park's fingernails and hands did not show any signs of resistance, and the house could not find any signs of outside intrusion. They speculated that it was possible that Mrs. Park had murdered her child first, and then chose to commit suicide. But this conjecture is not quite in line with common sense, because Mrs. Park is very healthy physically and mentally, and has not had any family conflicts with her husband. There was no reason for her to drag the child with her to commit suicide. And the scene to the children to take the means is very cruel. This way is not a mother can do out. Even if the mother really did it, under normal circumstances, will also put the children neatly, and then choose to die. But the children at the scene were separated and no suicide note was left. The police thought it was highly likely that they were murdered, and immediately launched an investigation into the surrounding area. The police reviewed the apartment's elevator surveillance, and captured Mrs. Park's best friend Ms. Lee getting off the elevator around 3 p.m. that day. At first, the police did not suspect Ms. Lee, because she was Mrs. Park's closest friend. She cried the most before and after the funeral, was in a constant state of grief, and did not look like she was acting. It wasn't until later, during her interrogation, that the police discovered she was deliberately hiding her left hand. She covered the back of her left hand with the sleeve of her shirt, which seemed like a guilty conscience. So the police asked her to show her hand to take a look, and it turned out that there was a straight line wound on the back of her hand, as if it had been cut by a thin line. So the police asked her what the wound was all about, and she said it was a wound she got while repairing the bathroom at home. But when the police continued to ask where to repair in the bathroom, she did not answer. So, the police immediately went to her place of residence and searched the bathroom she mentioned. They found no signs of the bathroom being repaired, indicating that Ms. Lee was lying. So the police continued to search her house, trying to find clues related to the case. As a result, they actually accidentally found a conclusive evidence, a plastic bottle that was cut open. This time, the police were really smart and perceptive. Who would normally think that such a discarded plastic bottle would be the key evidence? The crime scene, Mrs. Park's neck wrapped around the clothesline part of hanging on the door. That is, if Mrs. Park did not commit suicide by herself, then someone must have put the door in the middle, and borrowed force to use the lever pulley principle to pull clothesline down hard. The top of the door is generally square, not round. Such a shape is difficult to pull down, while also leaving traces of clothesline friction. So, put a plastic bottle cut in half on the top of the door. Will be the perfect solution to the problem. Not only will not leave traces, but also very easy to pull the rope, because the plastic bottle is acting as a pulley roll. When Ms. Lee confronted by the police, she finally admitted that she was indeed the culprit in the murder of the 3 people, and gave a detailed account of how she committed the crime. This case almost became unsolved at that time, because DNA detection technology was not available in Korea in 2003, and no evidence was found at the crime scene, and Ms. Lee had been ruled out as a suspect by the police at that time. No one expected that the injury on her hand and a plastic bottle that she had not disposed of after the crime would be found later. With Ms. Lee's confession, the police later found a diary at her home, which planned the murder and every detail of the plot in detail. To their shock, the plan was written by Ms. Lee 6 months earlier. According to Ms. Lee's recollection, she visited Mrs. Park's house in the afternoon of the incident. During this period, she requested Mrs. Park to play a piece of piano live, and brought Mrs. Park's 2-year-old son into the room, leading them in different spaces. Ms. Lee then went to the room where the little boy was while Mrs. Park was not looking, and used a pink cloth to pinch his nose and mouth until he stopped breathing. She then immediately put the clothesline on the door of the room, and made a lasso and advance on the clothesline. Then she walked out with a look that nothing had happened. Ms. Lee told Mrs. Park that she had a surprise program for her, and her 2-year-old son was ready in her room. Faced with her best friend who comes to her house 3 to 4 times a week, Mrs. Park was not the least bit wary and happily accepted. So, Ms. Lee lifted up Mrs. Park's long skirt and covered her face so she wouldn't peek, and then slowly led her to the door of the room. At this point, Ms. Lee put the lasso which made an advance on the clothesline directly around Mrs. Park's neck, and immediately went behind the door. She put a plastic bottle cut in half on the door frame, and pulled down the clothesline vigorously. Then, Mrs. Park was thus murdered by her best friend. The reason why Mrs. Park did not resist such a violent attack is that she was not only blocked by her skirt, but also holding her 10-month-old daughter in her hands. She was afraid to let go of her hand for fear that her daughter would fall to the ground. In other words, she sacrificed herself to protect her daughter and gave up resistance. After confirming Mrs. Park's death, Ms. Lee was still not satisfied. She then proceeded to murder Mrs. Park's the youngest daughter, who hadn't even formed her memory yet, by cruelly putting a plastic bag over her head. The 3 eventually passed away in this way. After committing the crime, Ms. Lee placed Mrs. Park's bag under the window of a room near the hallway, and opened the bag with a large slit. Then she quickly locked the door and walked to the hallway, threw the key into Mrs. Park's bag through a crack in the window, and left in a hurry. It wasn't until after 7 p.m. that night that Mrs. Park's husband contacted Ms. Lee and she came back to the scene. You may be thinking, isn't Ms. Lee the best friend of Mrs. Park? Why would she do such a terrible thing to Mrs. Park's family? And what was her motive? After investigation, the police found that Ms. Lee and Mrs. Park were high school classmates, and they did not have any interactions and had a general relationship while in school. Even after graduation, they did not have any contact with each other. Until the incident happened 2 years ago, they reconnected at an online alumni meeting, and Ms. Lee took the initiative to approach Mrs. Park and moved her home not far from Mrs. Park's house. Since Ms. Lee was single and usually did not have any dates, she visited Mrs. Park's house almost 3 to 4 times a week, and became close friends as a result. Even Mrs. Park's children liked her a lot. In 2 years, on average, they spent 300 days together, 3 times a week. And Mrs. Park's son was exactly 2 years old, which means that Ms. Lee witnessed the birth of Mrs. Park's 2 children. In such a situation, this woman also wrote the plan 6 months in advance, which is scary to think about. She told the police that she used to be an exceptionally good student in school, and Mrs. Park was so much worse than her. However, Mrs. Park became very successful later, and had a good husband and a happy family. She felt jealous because her own life was miserable, and thought that the world was unfair to her. She was 30 years old and still unmarried, without a husband, without a decent job, and living alone in a modest room. It was hard for her to accept that a classmate who was not as good as she was could have such a decent and happy family, which hurt her self-esteem. It is said that she fell in love with Mrs. Park's husband at that time, and once sent a message to Mrs. Park's husband saying that, "People like you got married too early." The police also found this sentence in her diary: "If I leave this world, I want to leave my property to my classmate's husband." As a result, there were rumors at the time that she was not jealous at all, but had other plan. She wanted to kill Mrs. Park and her child, so that Mr. Choi would lose everything, and then she would take advantage of the opportunity to take care of him. In time, naturally they could start a new family. There were even rumors that Ms. Lee was already having an affair with Mrs. Park's husband, and she may have done this just because she didn't want to stay as a third party all the time. So she designed this set of murderous events that looked like a secret room 6 months in advance, trying to directly block Mrs. Park and her husband from being together. But regardless of the motive, the fact that she ended up using such cruel methods to murder her classmate and her child shows that there is something very wrong with her as a person herself. Even if it's not Mrs. Park today, it could be another classmate living happily ever after tomorrow. Faced with such a brutal method of committing the crime, Ms. Lee was expected to receive the harshest punishment, but instead, she was only sentenced to life imprisonment. This is because she shamelessly submitted a petition and a letter of repentance during the trial, and apologized to the victims and stated that she was suffering from depression. So in March 2005, her death sentence in the first trial eventually became a life sentence. After the verdict, everyone's complaints could not be subsided for a long time. The 10-month-old girl could not even speak, and the 2-year-old boy was still so fond of her. Mrs. Park didn't have any intersection with Ms. Lee in high school. Why did Ms. Lee deliberately meet Mrs. Park after she got married, and pretended to approach her for 2 years, and finally destroyed her? Tragedies like this are really heartbreaking, and I hope that we can be more vigilant in our daily lives. Because there are really too many acts of deception like this. In the name of alumni and friendship, people should not trust everyone around them 100%. Because the only one who deserves 100% trust is ourselves. Let me know what you think in the comments section. And before you leave, make sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe for more. See you next time, and keep yourself safe.